Welcome to Amber Book, 40 Minutes of Competence. This is our weekly question. A bank shares a wall with a courtroom in an unsprinklered building. That wall must be rated to how many hours? And your choices are no rating is required, a 1 hour rating, a 2 hour rating, or a 4 hour rating. And you were encouraged to Google the building codes liberally because this is the kind of question that you would most likely find on a case study. For those who don't know, who haven't taken any of the exams yet, there are case studies, which are just what they sound like, that show up at the end of each of the 6 exams. Each one has 2, and each case study has between 10 or either 10 or 11 questions. So the last 20 to 22 questions are often found as a case study. And the case study may include, in the case of practice management, a case study may include something like a spreadsheet with the firm's employees and budgets on it, and in something like project management, it may include some contracts. But in most cases, it includes code, and it often includes both portions excerpted of the building code and a made-up kind of zoning code that may include like how many parking spaces you need or what are setbacks and that kind of thing. And so we're going to assume that you have access to that kind of thing, and you want to make sure to search when you have access to that. Now the answer to this one is a 2 hour rating. That's what we're looking for here as our answer. And for some of you guys who do code stuff all day, this was like the easiest question ever. And for some of you guys who never do code searches, this is like the most difficult question ever. And you have even though you know how to find the stuff, you never really believe that you've found it correctly, because the code is written in a way that architects aren't really used to conversing in. It's kind of its own legalese, foreign language, and you've been taught it 100 times, but learning the code by someone teaching it is a little bit like learning to ride a bicycle by reading about it. You just kind of have to do it, and so for some of you guys this will be a little bit easy, and for some of you guys it'll actually be pretty difficult. All right, so let's just start with this. According to the building, so the first thing we're going to figure out is what is the courtroom's occupancy classification. And so the answer to this is going to be assembly. And the reason we know that is we have this 4-legged stool, right? So we have the occupancy classification. That's what the building or your portion of the building is used for. We have the size of the building. That includes height, the total floor area, the total footprint area of the building, independent of how many floors there are, and a maximum number of floors. Then we have construction type, which is basically, I'm not sure why a portion of this looks like it's missing. There we go. Then we have construction type, which is basically how combustible is the structure. So we have type 1 A and B all the way up to type 5 A and B. And as we move from 1A to 5B, we're allowing more and more materials that may burn to become part of the structure. And then finally, we have our status as to whether it's sprinklered and possibly to what standard it's sprinkled. Sprinklered. I always say sprinkled, which always cracks me up for some reason. All right. So if we're going to start, we're going to start by saying, okay, let's look at the use and occupancy classification. And the Amber Book covers this. But like I said, if you don't do this every day, it's kind of in one ear and out the other. But it turns out to be fairly important on the exam and a pretty easy get. Like, in other words, it's pretty easy to mess up if you're not used to doing it. But if you just try it a little bit, you're likely to get these right. So what we're going to do is what we want to understand, anytime we're talking about adjacencies and fire separation, we need to start with what are the occupancies of the 2 adjacencies in question. And you can look that up. Again, it'll be in the case study. And typically what you're going to want to do is definitely use the search in the case study. So you'll want to use the search in the case study. There's a search feature, works like any other search feature. And don't be stupid. And by that I mean don't search for occupancy in hopes of finding the occupancy, because you know that in the code that they give you, if they include the portions on occupancy, occupancy is going to show up like 15 times. but you can be pretty sure that courtroom will not show up 15 times, maybe once, maybe twice. So pick the word that is least likely to show up, but that will still get your answer. And so if you're looking for the occupancy of a courtroom, don't type in occupancy, type in courtroom. I think you know this, but never sure. So anyhow, and you see courtroom will show up when you do it, and then you'll see it's assembly group A3. So assembly is the kind of broad category, and then within assembly they have A1, A2, A3, and so forth. So they have one group for things like theaters, and they have one group for things like outdoor stadiums. As you can imagine, they require different things, and they have one group for things like restaurants, and so forth. All right. When it comes to these occupancy classifications, you're going to be tempted to guess if you're in a hurry. I don't recommend guessing. It's worth a couple of seconds to look this up because assembly classification, which is A, business, which is B, institutional, which is I, and mercantile, which is M, and educational, which is E, if you try to guess, you can be misled pretty easily. For instance, a university lecture hall, I think the threshold is over 75 people, is not considered educational. Educational is mainly considered for occupancies for K through 12 schools, smaller classrooms of 20 or 30, that kind of thing, and younger kids. Likewise, you'd think maybe that a bowling alley or a funeral parlor or even a restaurant may be mercantile. They're merchants, right? But the code also considers them assembly spaces. Mercantile is for things like markets or department stores without the density of a bowling alley or a funeral parlor or a restaurant. And you could also assume that something like a museum or a library are institutional because they are institutions. And generally when we talk about if your firm got the commission to build a library and they built it, or a museum and they built it, on their website it may go under the institutional category. But as far as the code is concerned, they're also considered assembly. Assembly is where there's just a bunch of people, and the people may not know their way around in case there was a fire because maybe it's their first time in that museum. So when everything gets dark and smoky, they don't really know where to go. Institutional is not really about the fact that it's institutional. Institutional generally is not about government, civic buildings, and that kind of thing, but it's rather for buildings like hospitals or jails where people can't leave on their own. So institutional actually has a lot of requirements to make something that's institutional, and that's one of the reasons why hospitals and jails look so bad, is because there are just a whole bunch of things we can't do when we're making an institutional building because people can't leave, or at least they can't leave on their own volition unless they're ambulatory and they're not incarcerated. If your building has a high density of visitors, it can be an assembly occupancy. So that's what I'm trying to say. Even if it's not like a theater or a banquet hall or a concert hall or something like that, it's often going to be an assembly if there's just a bunch of people there. Now the business occupancy, which is the B, is spaces like for lawyers or architects or other office workers where people work there every day. There's not a huge density of people on crowded nightclub nights or something like that. And people generally, if the lights go out and it gets smoky, people should be able to feel their way around and kind of have a sense and an orientation based on their familiarity with the space. So again, use the search function, don't guess. And you want to search for the weird word, the one that's least likely to show up. So if you're looking for the number of parking spaces for a farmer's market, then type in farmers and see if that shows up, and it's likely to. All right, so we have the other side of the wall. The courtroom is assembly A3, we know that. And now we have on the other side of this wall, we have a bank. And for the bank, again, we need to find out what is the occupancy of the bank. Is it assembly, business, institutional, mercantile? You could probably make a case that it's assembly, because if a courtroom is assembly, why wouldn't a bank be? They both have documents, and they both have people there who may not know where they should be, and they have approximately the same amount of density on it when it's crowded, I guess, but maybe not. You could make the case for business because the bank is kind of like an architect's office or a lawyer's office. Or you can make the case that it's mercantile, it's kind of like a drugstore or a grocery store. Now again, you're not going to guess, but just to let you know, it's B. And the reason I know it's B is I did a search. I looked for bank, and this is what showed up, and it's under business group B. And in the case of B, there is no B1, B2. There's just B. So we have a courtroom that's A3, and then there's a wall, and then there's a bank, which is classification B. Now, not to be confused, a classification again is just about what kind of activities are happening in your space. The construction type is about how flammable can your construction be, and the two are related in the sense that depending on your occupancy type and the size of your building, that will determine typically the construction type that you're going to be building to. So if you have a very big building and it's a place like a jail or a place like a hotel where people don't know their way out, or a place like a jail where people aren't allowed to leave, or a place like a toxic waste disposal area where if there was a fire, it would be really catastrophic. There are going to be different rules than if you're in terms of how big your building can be and what it's constructed of relative to if you're a single family residence. All right, so just remember we have A3 opposite B. All right. Now, why is a bank or a post office or a barbershop considered a business in B classification while the courtroom is in A? I mean, certainly you could imagine a post office being the same as a courtroom, but all right, we'll just take it. Again, these code officials have to make tough calls and they have to separate them somewhere, and it's the same reason why you can't drink when you're 20 and a half, but you can drink when you're 21 and a half legally. It just, delineations are made, and that's what's made our code. Our code has all kinds of bad things. It wastes our time, and it is real pain in the butt, and it increases probably our liability if we mess up. And it's really anti-urban. I mean, it makes it really, mixed use is hard, and having buildings next to each other hard. They make the buildings more expensive. But there's no denying that the code has significantly reduced deaths from fire. They're down about 40% since 1980. So these codes have been working, in large part because of the code ever favoring and giving more leniency towards having sprinklers. So there are more buildings that are sprinklered. So we'll use search. Now this is the table you're looking for. So, and this one's kind of hard to remember. How would you search for it? Well, one way is you could remember 508.4. That'd be fine. And so you could start with that and just memorize that. Or you could try to remember separation. That'd be a good word to remember. But I think probably the best way to do it is it's a table. And the case studies documents are something on the order of, 10 to 30 pages in length. So it's not that hard to scroll through them, kind of browse through them, and look for this particular table. And what this table has is it has a bunch of occupancies on the as headers for the columns. It has a bunch of occupancies as headers for the rows, as titles for the rows. And what you want to do is remember you had an A3 and on one side of the wall and a B on the other. So you want to find the cell in the table that coordinates, that coincides with the A3 and on one axis and B on the other. So it used to be, for those who've been around a while, this stuff used to be in a table in chapter 3, 302.3.2. But it no longer is. It was in the section where we dealt with occupancies, chapter 3. It's now in the section where we deal with areas and heights and size of buildings, which is chapter 5. That's why it's now table 508. And I think they've cleaned it up a little bit, I guess. It's still, I find it to be a really confusing table, in large part because of the nomenclature that's used. So let's see if we can figure it out, okay? We have N, which means no separation is required. We have NP, which means it's not permitted. And we have NS, which means no sprinkler system. I find that to be confusing. And of course, S means sprinkler system. And if the number is 1 or 2 or 4 or 3 or whatever the separation is going to be, then that's the number of hours that our assembly is going to be rated. So let's start. We're starting with, remember we had an A3 for the courtroom, and so we see this A and E occupancies are this column, and we're not sprinklered. That was given in the assignment. So we want to go somewhere down there until maybe we run into B, which is here, and we go across and we see this dash. Now one could be forgiven in thinking, oh, maybe it's not allowed to have this adjacency, but no, that would be NP, that's not permitted. And one could be forgiven for thinking, oh, maybe if there's a dash, there's no separation required for these two. But no, that's N for no separation required. And so really what this dash means is it means we took the wrong guess. We started with the A in the column and the B in the row, but in reality, we have to start with the A. In this particular case, we have to start with the A in the row and the B in the column, because all of the data that's worthwhile is kind of up on this side. And to not be redundant, they don't include it down here. I wish they just have these cells missing altogether, but whatever. All right, so man, if an architect was ever in charge of cleaning up this code and making it more visual, I think the world would be a better and safer place. All right, so alas, we're stuck without a graphic language in the code with people like us who speak a graphic language, so we'll just deal. So we have our A, our assembly space, our courtroom here, and that includes all the A's. It's not just, you know, A1 or A2 or A3. Now over here we have like an H1 or an H2. Sometimes they're separated out, but in this case they're not for the assemblies. And we have our B for a column here, and specifically we have our no sprinkler B here, because NS means no sprinkler system. So we're gonna find where this row meets this column, and that's going to tell us what our separation requirement is, and it turns our separation requirement is 2 hours. That's how we got our answer of 2 hours. And you can imagine this is a pretty quick and easy thing to do once you've done it once or twice. But you can also imagine that if you have about 2 minutes per question and you had to kind of search through the code clumsily and look for it, then it might not be the quickest way or most efficient use of your time, because these are timed tests. And so when you're going through the case study portion of the test, you want to be efficient. All right. So that means we have to have a 2-hour fire separation. Now you'll notice that wherever two occupancies cross one another, like if let's see if we can find it. Like if B crosses B, so we'll come over here to B and down here, and you see there it's N, and really that's where all the N's are. So there's no separation typically required where we have two occupancies that are the same. So if you have storage on one side and storage on the other, or residential on one side and residential on the other, you're good to go. With some exceptions like this, or like this. But generally, we're talking about, there's always exceptions in this code, right? So, and I think you can rest assured that in general, if they have given you 2 minutes per question on average for the exam, you can rest assured that the questions they're going to ask you are typically not going to ask for exceptions. So if you're kind of a dotting your I, crossing your T kind of person, you're going to be tempted to look for exceptions to any of this and read the fine print. I wouldn't do that. If you are worried about that, flag the question, and you can come back to it later if you have extra time at the end of the exam. Likewise, if you have adjacencies that really don't lend themselves to being next to each other, so H1 is like a fireworks factory and I2 is like a hospital. So if we go over from I2 and we come down from even sprinklered H1, you see that that this is not permitted. And that makes sense, because remember, we're talking about a fireworks factory on the one side of the wall and a hospital on the other side of the wall, and we never want to build a hospital and a fireworks factory sharing a common wall for all kinds of good reasons, and so it's not permitted. So you have ones and you have twos, threes, and fours. You have not permitted. You have nothing no separation required, and so forth. Now there are some there are lots of fine print. We'll go over a little bit of it here, but it's really not that necessary for what we're talking about. The required, you can't cheat. So you can't be like, okay, if you're using occupancy in part to determine how big your building can be, or what type of construction type you're gonna need to build on with. You can't be like, oh, I have an opera house, which, as you might imagine, has a pretty high bar, a high threshold for what you can build with because of all the people. So if there was a fire, there would be a crush of people, and you want to make sure they can get out okay. And plus you have like maybe flame on stage as part of the opera. So you wouldn't, you have curtains hanging down and plush material everywhere. Anyhow, you get the idea. But let's say that opera house also has some business offices. So it wouldn't be unusual to have the opera house portion of the assembly be deemed an occupancy of A, and the occupancy of the business end of the opera house to be a B. Well, you can't use that to cheat the system. So there's all kinds of code saying you have to use the most restrictive. You can't say, oh, this is a business building. Because the reason you might want to is an opera house for different types of construction have maximum areas that are much lower than a business, than something like for a lawyer. So generally, and you could follow that all the way up, and that's how it's going to be. So generally, there's lots of reasons that an unscrupulous owner or a lazy architect might want to cheat the system, but the code has made that difficult. And likewise, any space with different tenants, spaces or dwelling units occupied by different tenants, have to have a fire barrier of at least 1 hour. So if you have two different people paying the rent, and that's how it's going to be kind of quasi-permanently, you have to make sure that it is in fact rated for an hour. Now what does that mean, rating for an hour? Well, it kind of turns your choice of walls from something that might be considered like a short essay question to something that's a multiple choice question, because you're going to want a wall or a floor ceiling assembly, but we're going to keep with wall in this example. You're going to want a wall that can have some kind of flame on one side, and it's going to take a little while for that flame to go across. And it's not just the wall. Often the doors have to meet a required rating, although often that door requirement is about 3/4 of the number of hours as the wall. So I should say, and any penetrations from something like a duct or a pipe or a conduit moving through the wall, that's going to need what's called fire stop. Often it's like a red putty to seal things up, because we want to make sure that the flames and the smoke don't come through. Likewise, the wall itself is going to be made of, if it's wood construction, it will often have multiple layers of gypsum board. If you've been working in firms for a little bit, you might notice that there's often a requirement in the spec for type X gypsum board. That's required in certain assemblies because it's less flammable. And so you may have a requirement, instead of just whatever you want, you may have to have like 2 layers on each side of type X gypsum board. That might make an assembly that has a higher rating. And so there are people, the reason I say you've moved from a short answer to multiple choice is because you have fewer choices as to what that wall is going to be made of. And the reason you have fewer choices is you have to make sure that you've used a wall, you've specified a wall that has been approved and tested by some laboratory, often Underwriters Laboratory, UL, but it could be others. It could be US Gypsum tested in their lab or something like that. But there are, as you might imagine, ANSI or ASTM standards for how a lab needs to test to determine what the assembly is, and so you can't go around futzing with that assembly, because whatever change you make will likely render the assembly not really kosher anymore, because that specific assembly that you changed because of your creative flourish no longer has been tested. So you kind of have to stick with what they've tested. And incidentally, if this kind of penetration happens to be a duct, then you need what's called a smoke damper. So in that wall, you're going to have a little device that has a damper, and a damper is just a blade that's on a pivot, and that blade will come down and it will block off in the event of a fire. It's within the duct, even though I didn't draw it that way, but in the event of a fire, that blade will come down and block off one space from the other, so that the smoke from this space doesn't get into the registers and grills and move their way across to the other space. So there's often a smoke damper required, and any penetrations have to be sealed up quite tidy, and the assembly itself has to be made either of multiple layers of gypsum board in the case of wood construction, or we didn't talk about this, but the fire code often likes concrete block or concrete construction too, because of course it's less flammable. So those often meet fire separation requirements. Now this, we'll see if you can figure out what the red line here means. Go ahead and take a second and figure it out on your own. All right, what this means is this red line means that it's a fire rated wall. And the red line, the fact that it goes, you see here, it's like, here, let's zoom into it. You see it's like long dash one, long dash one, long dash one. That means that wall has a 1 hour fire separation. And the fact that it's red, you would think I made it red so that I could identify what it was I wanted to show you. But actually it's red in the digital submission to the building code official. So this is actually just a red line, and there's a restaurant over here on this side of the wall, and there's an apartment complex over here on this side of the wall. And so if you were to go in and you were to look up the the separation between a restaurant, which is an assembly space of some kind, and the residential, multifamily residential on the other side, you would see that it requires a 1 hour separation. So that wall is going to have to be specified or detailed. The wall section is going to have to identify a wall that's been tested by someone to some standard, not just any standard, but an acceptable standard, that it has met a 1 hour fire rating. Now, does that mean that the fire won't burn through for an hour in practice? No, probably not. It just means it has a shot of lasting an hour, and it's going to last longer than a non-rated wall. It's not quite that precise, but in practice, in the field. But certainly in the lab, we can get pretty precise with this kind of thing. And then you see this little dashed line here. This is pretty interesting. This is what's called a water curtain, which is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a bunch of sprinkler nozzles that are intended to be kind of planar instead of spreading out in a circle. They're kind of planar, and they make a wall of water in the event of a fire. So if the sprinkler system goes off, they make a wall of water here, and that wall of water produces the 1 hour fire separation that's required. Now, as you might imagine, that's a little bit exotic. Not insane, it's not the only building I've seen with one of these, but it's a little exotic, and the reason is because the glass wall storefront here had to be maintained. It couldn't be replaced by it's an older building, it's a renovation of an older building. To achieve the tax credits, the historic tax credits, that facade had to stay intact. That glass facade had to stay intact. But to put a restaurant adjacent to, in this case, the ramp going down, and actually this is pretty interesting because it's an outdoor, see the doors here, it's an outdoor ramp. So we actually needed to have a 1 hour fire separation with all this exotic water curtain between the restaurant and an outdoor space. But that outdoor space is part of the egress path for the apartment building. So people can come out and go down, and so we have to separate the egress path of the apartment buildings from the restaurant. Now, this part I have highlighted in red, So this says existing water curtain glazing. That's what we were talking about. That's what's happening here. And this says existing 1 hour rated assembly. So there's an existing 1 hour rated assembly here for what for the business that happened to have been there before. And then this says hatch indicates existing 1 hour rated ceiling assembly, because the apartments are not only, this works in section, not just in plan. So the apartments are not only next to, in plan, next to the restaurant, but they're above the restaurant. And it says hatch area, and you're looking, saying, what hatch? It's just because when we brought it into Photoshop, the hatch kind of disappeared. That's the hatch. So all of this hatch here, all of this hatched area has to have, is a ceiling that has to also meet those requirements of a 1 hour rating, so that your fire from your restaurant doesn't pop up as easily to the apartments above. All right, that concludes this one. Now I'm going to give you next week's problem, and which seems to have slowed down a little bit. Hold on one second. There we go. All right, this is next week's 40 minutes of competence question. This one's probably a little bit more difficult and a little bit more involved than our others, but not by much. And it says, last month I volunteered to help out with the renovation of a building here on Virginia Tech's campus. People assemble there for banquets and weddings. The operators of the space field regular complaints of excessive reverberance. For instance, at a banquet, my dean may be recognizing faculty who won a teaching award, and each syllable of the dean's speech seems to linger in the air too long, interfering with the next syllable before it's uttered. So it sounds basically too much like a racquetball court and not enough like a recording studio. So the question is, how much extra sound absorbing material in square feet should be added to move this room to a 1000 hertz reverberation time of 0.40 seconds for improved speech intelligibility? So we want that room to sound a little bit less like the room I'm recording in now, and a little bit more like the room I recorded in for the Amber Book course that you guys have taken, where you don't hear as much reverberance. Because if I were to clap in here now, you can hear that sound kind of lingers for a little bit. All right, so we're given that I measured the existing reverberation time to be 0.73 seconds at 1000 hertz. The sound absorption coefficient of the absorbing material they chose, measured at 1000 hertz, is 0.95. I measured the total surface area of the surfaces in the room to be 4365 square feet. I measured the total volume of the room to be 11,619 cubic feet. And you can assume that the absorbing material that's going to be put on the board or on the walls will replace the gypsum board that's already on the walls, and the gypsum board has a sound absorption coefficient of 0.04. And to find the formulas you're looking for, check the, if you've been to my past 40 minutes of competence, we go there often. You can go to my end card, click on the demonstration exam, and then click yes a few times to say you want to start the exam. And then on the top, click on the references in the menu at the top, and then formulas for acoustics and plumbing and electricity and structures and so forth will show up. And so these were obviously the formulas you'll need are obviously in the acoustics section, and you might as well get used to using them. So that's our question for next time. So what we're going to do is I'm going to encourage those who are ready to go study, like ready to just get to it, to just get to it. I'm all for just going and being less smart and more kind of quantity time. But for those who want to stick around and ask questions, I will continue to ask questions. So bye to some of you, and I'm not going to unmute the rest of you guys quite yet. There are a couple of questions that came up in the chat last time that I want to address first, and after we're through with that, then I will unmute you and you guys can ask questions as well. So let's see what those questions are. Last time somebody asked, I want to ask a question around memory recall. Given all the content, like a whole lot of content, and the fact that at the moment I feel pressure with my time to read Meeb or Studio Companion over the recommended reading on neurology, do you have a couple of rules of thumb or advice on promoting recall 1 month out of the exam? Like, Should the last week or two be all about reviewing flashcards of key concepts? Should review be weekly as you go? How do I get my brain to the most optimal on test day? That's a great question. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, on the first 40 minutes of competence, I went over some kind of the neurobiology of how we learn, the kind of evolutionary science of our brains, the cognitive science. And this is an area that for some reason people didn't study. You would think people would want to learn about how we learn, but it really didn't occur to people till fairly recently. But there's been an explosion in research in that area, in part because it's important, and in part because it's a blue ocean. It's a green field. There's nothing growing there right now, so there's a lot of opportunity to learn a lot because it's an immature field. So what I recommend, I had a series of recommendations of books to read about, to kind of learn about this. But this person is saying, look, I don't have time to read that, which I get. If you're studying for an exam, you're probably better off reading these two if you're going to read. So what do we do? What's a boy to do? Well, what I would do, the most important thing is to not so much look at flashcards, but make flashcards. Or ask yourself and make yourself really answer aloud or written down, okay, different types of, have lists of topics as you study them, just general lists. And one topic may be the different flavors of project delivery. So you'll say, okay, I remember there was something about a construction manager, and there was something called CM at risk. What was that? And I remember IPD, because that was a weird one that's new and kind of flexible. There was something called multiple prime, cost plus fixed fee, and negotiated select team, and I don't remember the difference between them. So that would be the kind of thing that you would want to study, in your studies when you review, you would want to ask yourself, force yourself to look those things up. And the internet's amazing. I mean, you can just, if you're not, you don't have to, I mean, you guys are going to be tempted to be like, cost plus fixed fee, what was that again? Well, you don't have to go back and try to find it in the video, or they certainly can. You can just Google it, and you'll look at it, and you'll say, oh, right, I got it. Because the purpose of the videos was to get you familiar with the material, but it's okay to remind yourself with just a little bit of reading on Google. So that's that question. The other question that I got that I wanted to answer is, it says, for PA, PPD, and PDD, how far should we study Amber Book professional practice questions? There are about 400 questions. I get this question all the time. Normally you would think that they wouldn't be that important. And believe me, I am all about efficiency in studying. I know I just said I'm about quantity time and not quality time. That's just for getting started. Like, get yourself started on studying. But once you're actually doing it, you want to make sure you're studying smart. And I would totally say skip the professional practice, except that it turns out the professional practice content is important for PA, PPD, and PDD. In fact, in my experience and that of other people I've asked, approximately 15% of PPD and PDD of that content is actually found in the pro practice section of Amber Book. If you think that's ridiculous, I happen to agree. That's why I want you to treat this as one big exam, separated out day after day, for 6 straight days, or 6 out of 15 days, or something like that, depending on how much other things you have to do in your life. So that's why I want you to study all at once. But about 15%, that's a lot of content to leave on the floor. Without kind of taking it with you. So I would definitely study the Amber Book professional practice section, with the caveat that you can skip over the parts related to practice management. So stuff like staffing, salaries, and firm management, any question about that you can separate. Unfortunately, those aren't separated out, but you'll know it when you see it. Plus, we're making like a master list. It may not be ready for you guys when you're studying. It should be ready in the next couple of weeks. But there will be a master list, so if you want to look up a topic, like an index. So if you want to look up a topic, you could find out what video that will be on. We're always improving this course. I will not let it get stale. But project delivery, like the things I just talked about, multiple prime or how to pay a contractor, and contracts, like who gets to keep the rights to the drawings or something like that. Those are very much in play in PPD and PDD. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to allow you guys to unmute yourselves. If past experience is anything, I'll probably accidentally mute myself in the process, but I will do my best not to do that. And I'm going to say bye to some of you guys. And for those who want to ask questions in an audio way, you can do that. If you put your questions on the chat, I will go through all of those later, and I will answer relevant or important or universal questions on next week's call. So I will see some of you guys next week, and the rest of you, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now.
Hello, Michael. This is Elena, and I have a general question. So I've been dealing a lot with code in my office and stuff like that. And the question for you is in regards to this occupancy separation.
Yes.
So we can consider a building a non-separated occupancy if everything else works, of course. No allowable areas.
Oh, you cut out first. Hold on. You cut out for a second. You said you had a question about occupancy and separation, and then you said all I heard was something about a building. So say that last part again.
Okay, so if we have a building that is non-separated, so we have mixed occupancy, but the building is considered non-separated building, then we don't need to actually provide separation between the occupancy based on the table.
I am reluctant to say that kind of thing to 54 strangers because I don't know the individual situation. But that sounds reasonable to me. But
yeah, my question is sometimes on NCARP exam they give that question, and I see that the building as allowable area it works. You know, they don't tell me basically everything works, so I can consider the building as non-separated occupancy, and there's still the question asking what should be the, let's say, file separation between A2 and B or N occupancy.
What I'm gonna do, as you might imagine, I'm a little hesitant to talk specifics about code without actually having it in front of me, and I need a little time to do that. So I will tackle that question next week. That's why I just wrote it down. So I will look into whether or not you have to maintain a fire rating when there is a non-separated occupancy.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Hi, Michael. I have a question.
Sure.
So I'm reviewing heat island effect, high albedo, high emissivity, light colored roofs. And I got another question in terms of managing the microclimate of your site. And the correct answer, and I don't have the question in front of me, but the correct answer was like wood decking. And in that answer, the wood decking, if I have it right, wood decking has a low albedo. And I'm trying to keep straight in my head, like why is it effective on a deck, on like a Ipe dark colored deck that's maybe going to absorb heat, but then why is that better for the microclimate? But then in general, in terms of managing heat island, you'd go for actually the opposite, like a high albedo, high emissivity question, and then tacked onto that, I'm trying to keep straight, like, when you use foil in a envelope, in regards to like heat.
So it kind of does. It's always difficult without knowing the context of the question and what the other choices are to answer that kind of thing. You saw that question in another prep material?
Yeah, I think probably in like a ballast or a black spectacle?
Yeah, so it's hard to say for sure, but in general, a deck is actually outboard of the building itself. In other words, there's going to be an airspace typically between the deck. They're magical little things. They're so cool. They're like just little plastic. What are they called?
Pedestals?
Yeah, thank you. The pedestals that are adjustable because, of course, the roof slope is maybe 2%, so you want to keep your deck flat while your walkable deck flat while your roof slopes. And so that in that case, the deck itself is actually shading the building. So the heat's not conducting. Any heat that's gained on the deck is generally not going to conduct into the building because it's not part of the building. So essentially, it's like a shading element over the whole building. So most likely, that's why that has the beneficial kind of heat island effect thing. Because the heat island effect is about your building baking during the day and then just kind of retaining heat for a good portion of the night, so it doesn't get to cool off and the city is not properly flushed. In terms of the foil and when to use it, it's a complicated question. Actually, you're forgiven. Actually, both of those are really complicated. They're two of the more complex issues, and they both have to do with radiation, which is kind of magic anyway, because it deals with electromagnetism. But in the case of foil, you generally want to use foil where you only get a benefit from foil when there's an airspace on one side of the foil, or both sides, or I guess in theory both sides of the foil. So you can have foil-faced insulation if there's a cavity. So you might put foil-faced insulation on, for instance, an attic, on the ceiling below your attic, and then by making it reflective to heat, that when your roof is baking and there's heat coming in an electromagnetic way, when there's heat radiating from the underside of your roof down to the top of your ceiling, assuming there's an attic in between, you can reflect some of that with foil in a pretty clever way. That said, foil from an enclosure point of view and a moisture control point of view, foil is not moisture permeable. Vapor doesn't migrate through foil the way that vapor migrates through other surfaces. So if that foil is likely to be cold at any point, then and if it faces the inside of the building, and if the building on the inside happens to be humid in the winter, then it is quite possible you'll have condensation on that foil. Likewise, if that foil is one part of the assembly, but on another part of the assembly there is a roll-on, spray-on, or some kind of fluid-applied vapor control layer that's also maybe used to keep rain out, or a peel and stick layer, or something that's not vapor permeable, then you're going to have two vapor impermeable surfaces inside your assembly, and you never ever want two vapor impermeable layers inside your assembly if you don't have to, and you never really have to. So foil is one of those things that's a little tricky in general, but from the point of view of the exam, if there's an airspace and you put foil on it, an airspace will have an R value nominally of about R1, and if you put foil on one side of that airspace, it will have an effective R value of about R3, which is not bad to get an extra 2. And if you have foil on both sides, which again, you have to make sure if you do that it's vented, because you don't want to trap moisture in between the two layers of foil. But if you had foil on the underside of your rafters in your attic and over the joists on your ceiling, then that R1 actually can become like an R10. So it's a pretty significant thermal advantage. But the way it works is by essentially acting like a mirror to the heat that might otherwise radiate across between two surfaces.
Okay. I want to just go back really quickly to the first part.
Sure.
And say that if the question around the decking were to be more about the microclimate, the way that the heat island affects the climate around you, as opposed to, I kind of maybe threw in the foil in the house. But so if you had to choose something that had the least effect on your surroundings, would wood be a natural?
Yeah, I mean, wood doesn't hold heat very long, um, so it has a high emissivity. But more importantly, I think in this case, is that the building itself is what absorbs the heat, and if the wood is outboard of the building, which it would be, it wouldn't be part of the roof assembly. It would be there'd be air flowing from outside, in between the cracks in your wood deck, between your planks, and then back out. So if it was, for instance, if inside the building it was 70 degrees and outside it was 95, the temperature underneath the wood decking would be pretty close to 95. It would not be that close to 70. And so for that reason, it's not really part of the assembly of the building. And so you can consider the wood decking to be like an external shading device. So replace the wood decking in your mind with like a giant lattice that goes around your building that's 3.5 feet from your building at all sides or on the roof. And so it's basically a big parasol or a big umbrella for your building. So it will prevent your building, all the thermal mass in your building, from absorbing the heat from the sun, and it will therefore help the microclimate. It's less likely for that microclimate to heat up. Most of the heat island effect, most of the microclimate effects are happening overnight, because the buildings have absorbed so much of that heat during the day, especially on a sunny warm day. And then because they have high thermal mass, because of the masonry and just the material, that heat then stays and re-radiates to the city at night. And there's an effect during the day too, for sure. But shading it during the day will have a beneficial impact. Now, I don't know what the other choices were, but it's a.
What if it was a porcelain? What if? And this will be my last question because I don't want to hog the time. But what if it was like a white porcelain paver that had higher emissivity?
My guess is that the roof deck would still do better, for the same reason that if you have a choice to go outside and you don't want the sun beating down on you, you're better off in the shade than you are wearing clothes that are shiny. Clothes that are, or light colored clothes. So my guess is even then it would make more sense to have the roof deck.
Okay.
There are lots of bad questions in other people's material, but that's not one of them. If I'm understanding it right, that's actually a pretty reasonable question, and that makes sense to me, based on the way you've outlined it. But again, not having seen it, if you want to email it to me, if you can find it, I'll take a look at it.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else?
Hi, Michael.
Hello.
So I just wanted to clarify for the section 508, I think, with the separation of occupancy.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, when they tell you, when you see that chart and you see the dash line,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty much the code saying try again, or like switch the order of it.
Switch the order.
Okay.
Switch the order. So basically, everything in here is adjacencies between two of the same occupancy, and you can, just in the same way, you can say, is A next to B or is B next to A? And in this case, they just want to populate one half of the chart and not populate the other half. So this dash means switch the order, and then you'll find the real number.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, Michael, this is Nidhi here. My question is, can you elaborate a little bit the difference between incident use and accessory use? It's just a little bit confusing, and if you can summarize it.
I'll do that next time. Incident.
Okay.
Use and accessory use.
Yeah, I don't have too much experience working with these kind of assemblies. It would be helpful if you could just a few examples.
I'll pull that up for next time.
Okay, thank you.
Michael?
Hi, Michael. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I want to know, like, where actually we use fire door, like, for exiting out.
So you mean a fire-rated door?
Yeah.
So fire-rated doors are often, although not always, required in assemblies. There's another table for that. But generally, the fire-rated door, if you have a rated assembly, the door in between needs to be fire-rated. And what that means is exactly what you think. It means that the door has been tested to meet some kind of a number of hours. Now, the fire rating doors, they typically have a 3/4 hour, so 45-minute door. They have a 1.5 hour door, and so forth. And typically, though not always, the rating of the door is equal to the rating requirement of the door is equal to 3/4 of the rating requirement of the wall. So if you have a 1 hour wall, typically, but not always, you're required to have a 3/4 hour door. If you have a 2 hour wall, you're typically, but not always, required to have a 1 3/4 hour door. And what that means in practice is that the door is made of less flammable materials, and importantly, that the glass in the door is made of something that's not going to just kind of melt in the event of a fire. Now, we used to accomplish that with wired glass, but we don't anymore. Wired glass indoors is really dangerous. I mean, really dangerous in everyday use, because people push on them and sometimes the glass breaks and the wire just slices up your hands. The idea of the wire was to keep the glass together while fire was raging on one side. So for that reason, and maybe some others, we typically I don't think we ever use wired glass anymore. And if you have any old buildings with wired glass, it's probably one of the things you need to replace. Will require but the door and the glass and any windows in that wall or anything in that wall that has a rating for the wall is often going to require a window or a door rating that's, like I said, usually about 3/4.
So the exterior walls are usually not rated, right? So in that case,
No, exterior walls are often rated for one of two reasons. Either because the exterior wall is part of the structure, and the structure itself is rated, so if it's a load-bearing exterior wall, it may be rated. Or if it's too close, this is a crappy part of the code that makes it so our cities are ugly. If your building is too close to another building, there's a table for that, and your exterior rated wall may have to be rated. Your exterior wall may have to be rated, and the idea is that's why we don't. In history, you always learn about like Chicago burned and then Philadelphia burned, and cities were always burning, and cities don't burn anymore. And this is one of the reasons they don't, is because we have exterior rated walls when your building is very close to another building. There was somebody else that had a question that was starting to talk.
Hey, Michael.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, thank you. Great session so far.
Thank you.
Well, yes, sir. Hey, I was listening to the Shift Harden lectures on the contracts and proposals.
Aren't those fun?
Yeah, they're great. He recommends using the proposal as a contract itself. That surprised me because I have always thought of them as just a quote, just to get the project going. I want to know what NCAR feels about using a proposal in that way. Are we going to get tested in any of that area?
I think it would be highly unlikely that well, first of all, I mean, that guy's a genius. So anything he says makes good sense to me. I think it's highly unlikely that you'll get conflicting. There's so much to learn, you don't have to worry about conflicting advice. So as a general rule, you just don't have to worry about someone telling you something wrong, even though that may happen, because you're better off just kind of learning the concepts and continuing to learn than to follow up on those other things that are just driving you crazy. Now, if you have time, or if you like sorting this stuff out, sure. But I think it's highly unlikely that something that somebody said as kind of a life hack would then come up. Now, there's some exceptions. So one notable exception is the contracts are pretty clear that if there's and more importantly, the errors and omissions insurance is the liability insurance that you take on as an architect to protect yourself from being sued in the event of a building collapse or a fire or something like that, and someone wanted to prove that you did something wrong. They are pretty clear that you should not tell, if you see something unsafe on a job site, you should not tell the worker, you really need to hook yourself on, or you really need to stay a little bit more clear of that transformer box because it's live. They're very clear that you should not be doing that, because the fear is that once you do that, the contractor can come back later and say, well, you kind of took over the materials and methods of means and materials of construction when you did that. So the fact that I'm late is not because of me, it's because you told my subcontractor that he was too close to a transformer, and that set into motion a series of cascading events that held up the entire. So anyhow, if you see on the exam that you shouldn't say anything if you see something dangerous on the site, that's what you want to put. But in real life, of course, as a human being, if you see something that's dangerous, you probably should say something to somebody. And now if it's just mildly dangerous, I guess it could wait. But if there was a live wire near somebody who was working, I think it would be immoral and to not say anything. So there are a few cases like that. What else? There are a few cases where common sense and being a good human being is contrary to what and in practice it's done all the time. Architects will say, you might want to put up a railing there. I'm afraid someone's going to fall off to someone, and it's done all the time, and it rarely leads to a problem. Although, every time I say something like that, someone will email me and they'll share with me their problem that it did lead to. So please do that, and I will change my tune if somebody listening had a problem because they were like, "Oh, we put up a railing there." But in general, I wouldn't worry too much about that stuff.
Great, thank you, Michael.
We have time for one more question. All right, that concludes our adjacencies section, or 40 minutes of competence code adjacencies, and we'll talk about reverberation time and room acoustics next week. I look forward to seeing you guys then. Take care.